In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion on value returning methods.
So let's talk a little bit more about the return statement. So a value returning method is going to use a return statement to send some value back to the method that originally called the method. Our syntax for this is pretty simple. We have the word return and then some expression and then a semicolon. Now our expression here could be a variable, it could be a constant value, or it could be an expression that's evaluated to some final value, to some result. And the data type of the expression must match the return type of the method. So for example, if our method type is an integer, then the data type of this expression must also be an integer. I've seen several times where students have written code where the expression of the return statement did not match the return type of the method. And you usually get a compile error along the lines of your return type doesn't match the method or something along those lines. So then when Java sees the return statement, the current method immediately terminates, even if there's stuff that's afterwards. In fact, I don't even think Java will let you do that. It'll actually give an error message that says you have stuff after the return statement. But the current method would immediately terminate, and then we'll go back to whatever method called the method that just terminated. So let's take a look at an example. So let's say here's my program. It's called larger. It returns a double because it's specified right here. And we have two different parameters of type double. We have x and we have y. And notice that we can declare additional variables inside the method. So here we have a variable called max. So this is a new variable that we have just for this method. And we can declare as many new variables as we want in here. In fact, such variables are called local variables. And the reason why it's called a local variable is because once it's declared inside a method, only that method can use that variable. So if I try to use max outside of larger, Java is going to say I can't do that because it's only visible inside this method. And we see here that we get the larger value of x or y. We store that in max, and then our return statement is right here. So whatever the value of max is would be the value that gets sent back to the method that called larger. So once we have our definition, we can call this method in several different ways. We can have larger where we pass two double values. We can pass larger where we have two double variables. Or we can even call larger where we pass one of the values being just a strictly double number and the other being a variable. So any of these work. And the value that's returned from larger would be stored in num because we see here we have an assignment statement. So larger would evaluate to some number. So we can kind of think of taking the result of larger and replacing it with that result, and then that gets stored in num. Now, it is possible for a method to have more than one return statement. This is allowed. You have to have at least one, but you can have more than one. And the first one that's read will immediately end the method. And whatever value is part of that expression is what gets returned to our to whatever method called it. So just to give an example here of our larger method, so instead of having a max variable and having it store the result of whether x is larger or y is larger, I could say instead, if x is greater than or equal to y, well, I'll just return x. And if that's not true, I'll just return y. I mean, in this case, we can even omit the else if we wanted to, because, technically what's going on here? So, if it's true, we're going to do our return statement, and if it's false, we just skip that return, and we can just run the return statement. So the else part here really isn't necessary. We just show it as a way of saying that we can have return one value if condition is true, and we can return some other value if it's false. Now, as I kind of said earlier, if the compiler can determine that during execution that some of the statements will never be reached because of a return statement, then we're going to get a syntax error. So as an example with this code, we see that we have our return statement right here. What this means is as soon as I get to this line, I'm going to immediately terminate my program, or not my program, but my method, and anything afterwards just doesn't happen. So in this case, A is never printed because this because the return statement happens beforehand. So this print line method will never get called. And this will return at least one compile error. It'll say that this statement right here just simply isn't reachable. So you need to change it so that either you don't have this line or your return statement happens after this line. Since we are now dealing with several different methods, like our main and any other additional methods that we make, we need to make sure we understand what method controls the execution of our program at any point, because let's face it, we can't have all the methods control the execution, because whenever we're running some line of code, we're always at some point among all the methods. So who's in charge at any given point? Well, at the very beginning of every program, we always start with main. Like I think I said a long time ago, main is the starting point of any program. So we have to have a main. So it starts there. Now, if we call any method inside of main, we're going to go to the definition of that method. And if that method calls a different method, we'll go to the definition of that method and so forth. So for any additional method calls, we're always going to jump control to the definition of the method that we call. Now, when this method is done, the control goes back to the method that made the call. And then the exact place where we resume execution is the line immediately after the method call. So like if we have a method in our main, and so we call the method, so we're at that particular point in our program, and then we go to our definition and we do some stuff, and then when we come back, we resume right where we left off. So the next line immediately after that method call will be the next line that we run. And then if we have a value returning method, when we return, we can think of the value that's being returned replacing the method call. So for example, let's say I have the method call x equals my method a, and this method returns the number 5. When we're done with my method, we can think of our statement as being more like x equals 5. So 5 just simply replaces the whole my method a part of my code.